Most people believe that mental exhaustion comes from carrying an overwhelming burden or working past the point of collapse. Rui discovered that everything changes the moment you stop treating every minor choice as a critical crossroads. He stood frozen in the mountain dojo, a single black iron tsuba clutched tightly in his white-knuckled fist, completely paralyzed as his rival's wooden blade stopped an inch from his throat. He had not been physically outmatched, nor was he lacking training, yet his mind was completely drained, trapped in an invisible prison. What happened next rewrote everything he thought he knew about his own mind. The morning sun crept through the cedar screens of the training hall, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished oak floor. Ren lowered his practice sword, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythmic breaths. He looked at Rui not with anger, but with deep confusion. Rui still stood in his stance, his muscles locked, his eyes wide and unfocused. The strike had been predictable, simple, and entirely avoidable. Rui had seen it coming from a mile away, yet he had remained as still as a stone monument in a cemetery. From the back of the hall, Master Kenzo stepped out of the deep shadows. He carried no weapon, only an old wooden bucket filled with fresh water. He did not ask Rui to assume the stance again. He did not comment on his dropped shoulder or his unstable footing. Instead, he walked directly up to the frozen young warrior and looked him in the eyes. "What did you eat before the sun crossed the ridge this morning?" Kenzo asked, his voice low and scraping like gravel. Rui blinked, the sudden shift in context shattering his paralysis. "Sensei, I had millet porridge, and there was a dried persimmon. But I spent a long time wondering if I should eat the persimmon first or save it for the noon hour. I could not decide." "And the path up the mountain?" Kenzo continued, ignoring the confusion tightening Rui's face. "Which trail did you take through the bamboo groves?" "I stood at the stone lantern for many minutes," Rui admitted, lowering his hands. "The western path is steeper, but shorter. The eastern path is smooth but winding. I walked back and forth between them before finally setting foot on the western stones." Kenzo set the wooden bucket down with a heavy thud, the water sloshing against the rim. "You did not lose this match to Ren just now. Ren is a formidable swordsman, but you have deflected his swiftest cuts before. Today, you lost to a dried fruit and a stone lantern 2 hours before you ever stepped into this dojo." Rui looked down at the black iron tsuba in his hand, his brow furrowing. "Sensei, I do not understand. A dried persimmon has no edge. A mountain path cannot strike a blow. How can those trivial choices have anything to do with my defeat on this floor?" Kenzo crouched down, gesturing for Rui to look into the still water of the bucket. "Look closely. When you stood before Ren, your mind was not watching his blade. Your mind was a crowded room. You were actively deciding whether to step with the left heel first or the right toe. You were weighing 3 different blocks, sorting through them like an old merchant counting copper coins in a busy market. The moment that required your absolute presence arrived, passed, and struck you down while you were still standing at the threshold of your own decisions. But it happened in an instant," Rui muttered. "I did not feel myself thinking. It felt instantaneous because the rot is buried deep beneath where you normally look," Kenzo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your mind has spent the entire morning standing in front of open doors, refusing to walk through them. This match is simply the first time that hesitation cost you something visible to the eye." But that was only the surface of the problem. Rui believed that if he simply forced himself to be more disciplined, the fog in his mind would clear. He assumed that a warrior's fatigue was a badge of honor, a sign of hard work. The next morning, Kenzo handed Rui a small piece of charcoal and a blank scroll of rice paper. The instruction was deceptively simple. For 7 full days, Rui was to make a single black mark on the paper every single time he caught himself weighing 2 choices against each other, no matter how insignificant they seemed. By the time the evening bell chimed on the very first day, Rui returned to the master's quarters with his head bowed in profound embarrassment. He laid the scroll on the tatami mat. The marks were a chaotic, dense swarm of black lines that crowded the borders of the paper. "I had to stop counting before the noon sun reached its peak," Rui said, his voice tight with frustration. "There were simply too many. Once I began to look for them, I could not stop seeing them. I spent minutes deciding how deeply to bow to the village elder, which water jar to fill first, and even how long to rest between steps on the temple stairs." Kenzo nodded slowly, his expression entirely unreadable. "How does your chest feel now that you can see the marks?" "It feels heavier," Rui said. "It is deeply uncomfortable. I never realized my spirit was constantly spinning in circles over things that do not matter." "It was always spinning," Kenzo said, leaning forward. "The only difference is that you have finally opened your eyes to the friction. This discomfort is the first step of true clarity. You are exhausted by evening not because the training is hard, but because you are bleeding your life force through 1,000 microscopic cuts before the real work even begins." For the remainder of that week, Kenzo altered the task. Rui no longer needed to carry the charcoal, but before sleeping, he had to record the 3 specific decisions that had taken him the absolute longest to resolve that day. When the week ended, Rui studied his own writings and discovered a bizarre pattern that made no logical sense. The choices that demanded the most time were never the ones that carried actual consequence. The previous night, when a sudden storm threatened to flood the grain storehouse, Rui had moved instantly, making high-stakes decisions with absolute certainty. But later that same night, he had spent nearly 20 minutes staring at 2 identical ink brushes, completely unable to choose which one to use for a basic writing exercise. "This is the great deception of the uncultivated mind," Kenzo explained, pointing a long finger at the log of brushes. "We assume our attention matches the importance of our choices, but the reality is completely inverted. The momentous decisions are made swiftly because their inherent weight forces the spirit to respond with immediacy. But the trivial options have no natural weight. Because both options are virtually identical, your mind has no anchor to grasp. It spins over the 2 paths forever, simply because nothing forces it to stop." "So the smallest choices are actually the most dangerous?" Rui asked, a chill running down his spine. "Precisely," Kenzo replied. "A massive stone dropped in your path demands that you climb it or move around it. It forces a resolution. But a handful of sand in your sandals can be carried for miles, grinding away at your skin until you can no longer walk. You never decide to stop and empty the sand. You just keep moving forward, carrying the unfinished choices into the next hour." What Rui found next made the first lesson feel entirely incomplete. He realized that even when he recognized these tiny crossroads, he was still entirely powerless to stop his mind from lingering at them. As the second moon of the season rose over the mountains, Kenzo led Rui down to the edge of the rushing river that bordered the dojo lands. The water crashed violently against the jagged rocks, spray rising into the cool night air. "Most of what your mind perceives as a choice is an utter illusion," Kenzo said, watching the torrent. "I call them false doors. They present themselves to you as 2 open paths, but in reality, one of them was never truly available to you from the beginning." Rui looked at his master, his hands tucked inside his heavy indigo sleeves. I do not understand, Sensei. If I see two paths, how can one be closed? Let us examine your journal, Kenzo said, pulling a small scroll from his robe. You wrote that you spent an hour yesterday deciding whether to stay up late reading the old strategy texts, or to sleep early before our dawn archery trial. Tell me, if you had chosen the texts, what would have happened to your arrows at first light? My hand would have trembled, Rui answered honestly. My focus would have been scattered. I would have missed the target entirely. And is that a failure you were genuinely willing to accept? Were you truly prepared to disgrace your ancestors by throwing away your archery practice? No, Rui said, lowering his eyes. I could never accept that. Then the door of reading late was never opened to you, Kenzo said, his voice ringing over the sound of the crashing water. It was a false door. Sleeping early was the only real path available to you, based on who you claim to be and what you truly desire. Yet, your mind treated them as equals. You wasted an hour of your life arguing with yourself on the surface, pretending a decision was still required when the truth had already been settled deep within your heart. Rui stood entirely still on the riverbank, the weight of the master's words settling heavily upon him. Are you saying that my inner conflict is nothing more than a show? An act? It is a distraction, Kenzo said firmly. The surface of your mind is simply refusing to acknowledge what your deeper self has already decided. You replay the question over and over, hoping that if you ask it enough times, a magic third path will appear that allows you to avoid the sacrifice that every true choice demands. But how do I spot a false door before I waste my energy on it? Rui asked, his voice raw. You must stop asking your intellect, Kenzo said. The moment a choice arrives, imagine yourself fully taking the first option. Live with every consequence, every loss, and every hardship that follows it. If something deep within your gut immediately recoils and objects, that path is dead. The door is an illusion. Walk away instantly. Rui began to apply this rule aggressively. When he stood at the fork in the mountain path, he no longer weighed the steps. He knew he wanted to arrive at the dojo with his lungs clear and his heart calm. The steep, rocky path would leave him gasping. The smooth path was the only real choice. The decision took less than a heartbeat. For 2 weeks, the world seemed to grow quieter. The answers were so obvious that Rui began to wonder if the exercise was simply too basic to be of any real value. He went to Kenzo's quarters to express his doubts. The answers have always been obvious. Rui, Kenzo said, pouring a cup of bitter green tea. What you failed to realize until now is how much time you were wasting pretending they were complicated. The practice is not teaching you how to find answers. It is exposing how quickly the truth is always waiting for you when you stop entertaining illusions. The answer was not where anyone expected it to be, because recognizing a false door was only half the battle. Rui was about to realize that knowing a path is closed does not mean your mind has stopped looking back at it. By the 3rd month of his training, a new form of internal friction began to surface. Rui noticed that even when he made an instant choice, his mind refused to let go of the unchosen alternative. If he chose to use the heavy oak practice sword, he would find himself looking over at the lighter bamboo blade during breaks, wondering if his form would look cleaner if he switched. If he decided to spend his evening maintaining his armor, his mind would drift to the village tavern, wondering what stories the other men were sharing over their sake. He found himself constantly checking on the paths he had already left behind, like a paranoid guard checking locks on empty rooms. You are paying a massive continuous maintenance cost on dead possibilities, Kenzo said when Rui confessed his struggle. Choosing the iron blade but staring at the bamboo is like crossing a bridge but keeping one foot planted on the far bank. You are tearing yourself apart. But I have already made my choice, Sensei. Rui argued. Why does the ghost of the other option still pull at me? Because closing a door fully feels like a death to the unformed mind, Kenzo said, his eyes narrowing. The ego hates to lose options, even options it never intended to use. It wants to believe that everything is still possible, that every path remains open forever. So it keeps a tiny thread of attention tied to the ghost of the unchosen path, just to feel a false sense of security. Kenzo reached onto his shelf and pulled down an old, heavy iron padlock. He set it before Rui with a sharp click. From this day forward, whenever you make a decision, you must perform one small, deliberate physical action that signifies the absolute end of the choice. Kenzo commanded. If you choose a weapon, place the other completely out of your sightline. If you choose a path, turn your back completely to the alternative and do not look back. If you choose to study, close the screen of your room completely. This will feel foolish to you. It will feel unnecessary. Do it anyway. The next morning, Rui chose his training garments. Instead of leaving the other robes hanging on the wall where he could see them, he rolled them up tightly and buried them deep within a wooden chest, slamming the lid shut. When he selected his practice blade, he took the unchosen swords and carried them to the opposite side of the compound, stacking them face down in the dark armory. At first, a wave of intense resistance washed over him. He felt ridiculous performing these dramatic physical rituals for such minor everyday tasks. But within 10 days, a profound shift occurred. Because the unchosen alternatives were physically removed from his field of view, his eyes had nothing to glance at. And because there was nothing to glance at, the thoughts simply starved to death. His mind stopped reevaluating decisions that were already in the past. When he sat down to eat his simple evening meal of rice and radishes, he was entirely there, tasting every grain, completely undisturbed by the phantom choices that used to haunt his evenings. The feeling of foolishness you experienced at first was simply the resistance of your ego, Kenzo remarked weeks later, watching Rui rest calmly by the well. It was the visual proof of the mental tax you had been paying your entire life. Now that you refuse to pay it, look at how much of yourself has returned to the present moment. But Kenzo was not finished. He knew that managing the choices that arrive is only a temporary fix. True mastery required changing the very nature of what enters your life in the first place. As the 4th month arrived, Kenzo led Rui into the deep storeroom at the back of the mountain dojo. The room was packed to the rafters with generations of accumulated gear, variations of lacquered armor, stacks of straw sandals, dozens of whetstones, and chests filled with varying weights of iron arrows. When a young apprentice is chosen to travel to the capital for the winter tournaments, Kenzo said, gesturing to the chaos, they usually spend 3 days in this room. They weigh every piece of leather, compare every sandal, and argue with themselves over which blanket will provide the most warmth without slowing their stride. They leave this room weeping with exhaustion. Kenzo then walked over to a small wooden peg near the door. Hanging from it was a single, modest canvas rucksack, covered in dust but perfectly packed. "This is my traveling pack," Kenzo said, holding it out. The contents of this bag have not changed by a single needle or thread in over 15 years. When the Lord calls for my counsel, I do not spend days in this room weighing my options. I walk to this wall, I take this bag, and I depart. The decisions regarding what belongs inside were made once, perfectly, more than a decade ago. Because it was decided properly once, it never needs to be decided again. Rui looked at the simple bag, a realization beginning to bloom in his mind. We believe that having a room full of choices is a form of wealth, he murmured. It is a form of poverty, Kenzo corrected sternly. Every single item in this room is a tiny door that forces itself open in your mind the moment you cross the threshold. 10 items create 10 doors. 100 items create 100 open loops. You will bleed your spirit dry trying to sort through them every single time, unless you have the courage to make the choice once and let it stand as law. Over the following weeks, Kenzo forced Rui to ruthlessly standardize the recurring patterns of his daily life. Instead of choosing what to wear each morning, Rui selected 3 identical gray training kimonos and discarded the rest. Instead of deciding what to eat each dawn, he committed to a single, unchanging bowl of miso soup and rice for the next 30 days. He established a rigid, unchanging sequence of movements to begin his daily sword practice, eliminating any question of how to start. At first, a sense of heavy boredom crept over him. He missed the tiny sparks of variety that used to break up his days. But by the 3rd week, the boredom transformed into an incredible, radiant lightness. His mornings became entirely empty of friction. He woke. His body moved through the standardized sequence without a single moment of hesitation or debate, and he arrived at the training floor with his mind completely pristine. The mental energy that used to be burned away before the sun was high was now fully preserved. It flooded into his eyes, into his grip, and into his awareness. The days felt twice as long, not because time had slowed, but because his attention was no longer fractured into 1,000 pieces. This is not about living a sparse or empty life, Kenzo whispered as they watched the mountain mist roll through the valley. It is about understanding that every unnecessary option is a hidden tax on your sanity. When you drastically reduce the number of doors that open in front of you without your permission, you finally save your true strength for the choices that actually deserve your soul. They stood together at the edge of the dojo cliffside, the wind whipping through their robes. The training was reaching its final apex. Do you remember that morning 4 months ago with the 2 practice swords? Kenzo asked suddenly. The ones you could not choose between? I remember it perfectly, Rui said, a smile breaking across his face. If I were to lay those exact same 2 blades before you right now, what would your mind do? I would simply reach down, pick one up, and begin to strike, Rui said without a single trace of hesitation. It would not matter which one met my fingers first. Kenzo smiled, his old eyes crinkling at the corners. That is the state of Funbetsu. True discernment is not a complex strategy for making better choices. It is not the act of rushing through your decisions, using brute force or sheer speed. Speed is nothing more than a desperate attempt to run across a collapsing bridge while your doubts are still screaming underneath. Funbetsu is the quiet ground that remains when the useless options have been cleared away entirely. Rui looked back at the long path he had traveled over the last 4 months. He saw the counting that had revealed his hidden mental leaks. He saw the false doors that had stripped away his illusions. He saw the physical closures that had stopped the bleeding of his past choices. And he saw the radical reduction that had kept the world from crowding his mind. When a man has done this internal work, Kenzo continued, gesturing toward the horizon, a trivial choice ceases to be an obstacle. 2 identical swords are no longer a crisis. They are simply 2 pieces of wood. One is lifted, the other remains, and absolutely nothing is lost, because nothing was ever truly at stake. And when the massive, terrifying choices of life finally do arrive, you will recognize them instantly. They will feel completely different. They will have a profound, unmistakable weight, and you will have the absolute full capacity of your spirit ready to meet them. Because you haven't spent your day dying by 1,000 tiny cuts. 2 moons later, the ultimate test arrived. The senior instructor of the province announced he was leaving for the capital, and Master Kenzo formally offered Rui the position of head disciple. It was an immense honor, but it came with massive stakes. It would permanently alter his path, demanding that he sacrifice hours of his personal training to guide 50 young, rebellious students every single morning. The old Rui would have spent weeks paralyzed by this crossroads, tossing and turning in his bedding, weighing the prestige against the heavy burden, asking everyone for advice, and drowning in self-doubt. The new Rui sat quietly in his room for a single evening. Because his mind was completely free from the noise of 10,000 daily micro-decisions, he could feel the true weight of this choice with absolute crystalline clarity. He looked deep into his core, aligned the choice with his ultimate commitment to mastery, and allowed the answer to rise naturally to the surface. The next morning, he walked to Kenzo's quarters, bowed deeply, and accepted the responsibility with a calm, clear voice. He did not look back. He did not wonder if he had made a mistake. The choice was made, the door was shut, and his entire being moved forward into the work. Years later, when Rui had become a master in his own right, his own students would often marvel at his terrifying presence on the floor. He didn't move with unnatural speed, nor did he speak with booming arrogance. What terrified them was his absolute lack of hesitation. When he chose to strike, the blow simply existed. When he chose to move, he was already there. It was as if there was no gap between his soul and the physical world. One evening, a young, exhausted apprentice approached him by the stone lantern. "Sensei, how is your mind so incredibly quiet? I have watched you for a year, and I have never seen you falter, even for a second over the smallest things." Rui looked down at the young man, recognizing the exact look of profound exhaustion in his eyes. He reached down to his side, unclasped 2 identical wooden practice swords from the wall rack, and held them out into the fading light. "My mind is no quieter than yours," Rui said softly, his voice echoing through the silent dojo. "But I have stopped standing in front of doors that were never truly open, and I have stopped looking back at paths I have already walked through. You are not tired because your life is too heavy. You are tired because thousands of false choices are draining your spirit every single day without your permission. Choose one of these blades right now, and watch exactly what your mind does before your fingers even touch the wood." The next video reveals exactly why this works. It starts right now.